So, hello everybody. And first, thank you, Ethan, to join us tonight. And I really appreciate you take time to share with us all your experience and vision about Aikido. I'm lucky to talk with you, and I'm sure people will learn a lot of things about Iwama Aikido history, feeling of Aikido, lineage of Aikido, and the way you see Aikido and its preservation now. So first, really thank you to join us. And can you first introduce yourself to everyone?
Sure. My name is Ethan Weisgard. I was born in America and I moved to Denmark in 1969 when I was 12 years old. I've lived in Denmark ever since. I lived in Japan for a year and 3 months together with my wife, who is Japanese, and our two children in 1990-91. But otherwise, my base is here in Copenhagen, Denmark. I'm a musician by profession originally. I'm a drummer, and I've been a professional drummer all my life. And Aikido and music have been my two main loves, together with my family, of course. I started training Aikido when I was 18 years old in 1976 here in Copenhagen. And I was connected to a Japanese teacher who lives in Stockholm, Sweden. His name is Takemusu Sensei. And the two of his highest ranking students in Sweden, Ulf Evenås Sensei and Lasse Andersen Sensei, were the sort of liaison between Tomita Sensei and the Danish group. So they've also played a very, very important part in our Aikido development in Denmark and also my personal Aikido development. But Tomita Sensei was my first Japanese sensei. And I trained under him and was very, very inspired by him. For the first 8 years of my training, he came to Denmark and we went to Sweden and traveled all over Sweden with our Aikido group to train under him. Extremely inspirational sensei. He was originally a sensei of Nishio Sensei and during his university training. Then he went on to train under Saito Sensei and was in Iwama under Saito Sensei also when O Sensei was alive. He took care of O Sensei when O Sensei was ill and his last days on this earth. And it was through Tomita Sensei that I was able to go to Japan to train directly under Tomita Sensei's sensei, Saito Sensei. I had trained at a seminar with Saito Sensei back in 1977, 78, the first time that Saito Sensei came to Denmark and Sweden. I didn't get to know him personally at that point, but I trained under his guidance and could see that he was an amazing sensei, technically, but also as a person. And so in 1984, I was able to make the trip to Iwama and stayed there for 2 months as Uchideshi. I went there together with another of the instructors from the Copenhagen Aikido Club, which was my original dojo. It wasn't mine. We were a group of instructors that ran the dojo. And the 2 months there were incredible. It was very, very intense. We were the only Uchideshi there. We were 4 Danish people. And we had very, very close and very direct contact with Saito Sensei every day. None of us spoke Japanese at that time, maybe 4 or 5 words. But we managed, and Saito Sensei was very, very good at communicating without even having to use the language. And we had some very, very helpful people there who had been there a long time and could translate for us. So 2 months of fantastic, intense training and also living with Saito Sensei. He was a teacher that not only taught us amazing Aikido and shared extensively his knowledge, but he also taught us about Japanese culture and was very, very open to sharing those aspects of Japan as well. It wasn't just technique, it was very much about understanding Japanese culture, etiquette, and those two things go together. So after the two-month stay, that sort of established a kind of direct connection to Saito Sensei. And that was in '84. And then we started inviting Saito Sensei to Denmark to come for week-long summer camps, which was an amazing experience. We had him for 5 or 6 days of training. And it was morning, afternoon, and evening, and then talks during the evening and parties, and just socializing and being with him throughout the whole day and for this whole week period. I think we had 10 seminars with him altogether, 5 of which were these week-long seminars, and others were weekend seminars. And I would go back. I met my wife the first time I was in Japan, and we established a family, had 2 beautiful children, and we went to Japan every other year, the summertime, so that the family would get a feeling of belonging to that country as well. And I would stay as Uchideshi for shorter periods at that time, but having established sort of a connection with Saito Sensei, and also being able to speak the language more and more, I was able to sort of jump straight into the Uchideshi life and immerse myself very directly. I didn't have to get used to it again. And Saito Sensei was extremely open in sharing his knowledge, technically as well as otherwise. And because he knew that I had a Japanese family, he was a little bit strict with me. In terms of the cultural aspects and the aspects of etiquette and things like that. And that was great, because if nobody tells you that when you're making a mistake, you can keep on making that mistake all the time. But he would be strict, and he would scold you if you were doing something wrong, both technically, but also in terms of correct behavior and traditional manners and traditional etiquette in the dojo and out. So it was an amazing experience. And then living there in 1990, 91, we had a chance of really feeling how it is to live in Japan. I stayed as Sotodeshi at that time, which means that I was living outside of the dojo. I was living in the town next to Iwama, and I would go to the dojo to train, but I wasn't living there. But I was there for 1 year and 3 months, which established a very, very nice sort of relationship, long-term relationship in that way. And also with the other Sotodeshi who were living there at the time. Some of you will probably recognize people such as Miles Kessler, who was there at the time. Louis de Quiros was also there. Alan Roberts from Down Under. He's from New Zealand, actually not Down Under, but close by. And Patrick Cassidy was also there. So it was a fantastic group of Sotodeshi. And so there was a long, long period. I was a student of Saito Sensei's for 18 years. And luckily I was able to speak with him. I translated for him at our seminars here, and I also traveled around Europe and translated for him. And got to know him. He got to know me. He got to know my wife, who he was very, very friendly with. He was very happy that there was somebody that could translate for him culturally as well, because she could read between the lines of what he was saying, if he wanted something, how we should do it. So she was really a cultural translator as well. And she came from the same prefecture, Ibaraki, as he did. So there was a kind of a local bond there too. So that's the history. And that makes me want to talk about the way that Saito Sensei was teaching. Because it's important to know that he was a groundbreaker in terms of his pedagogical way of teaching. The traditional way in Japanese martial arts, Budo in general, and as for us as Aikido, is for the student, it's learning by doing. The sensei will show you a technique, and then he'll basically just say, "Hai dozo," just go ahead. He won't explain, he won't tell you what to do, what to look for. And in most cases, you can do all sorts of make all sorts of mistakes, and he'll just look at you, and it's up to you to try to figure everything out. And Saito Sensei wasn't that way at all. He was famous for using the word dame. Dame is it's a wonderful word. It means bad, incorrect, and it's usually something that it's told to you by a teacher or especially a parent. It's sort of a loving way of scolding somebody. And dame is double dame. And he would use that often. And he would use all sorts of variations, but it's always dame. And he was basically scolding you for doing something wrong. And that is a way of helping you, because you would notice after a while that he would only correct the people who really made an effort to try to get better. If he corrected you and he could see that you weren't trying, it didn't matter if you actually got it better. If he could just see you were trying, then he would make believe that he thought you were doing it better and give you a thumbs up. But if he saw that you were just sort of not really that involved in it, then he would just basically sort of stop giving you the dames at all. So it was a way of showing his interest in you by correcting you directly. He would also do things like he would see you making a mistake, and he would stop class and have you stand in the middle and show the technique the way that you're doing it. And then he would say, "Dame," and he would point out the mistakes you're making. And that, in a way, it's not, the modern pedagogical system at all, because you're sort of showing everybody else that this person is making a mistake. In a way, it's sort of strengthening your character, because you have to be able to withstand being told that what you're doing is wrong and having to show it in front of everybody else. But it's also building character. It is teaching you to put your ego away. Because the other part of this way of teaching is that the point is that if you are making that mistake, you should count on that other people are making that mistake too. He's using you as an example, but it's a general example. And the idea is that if somebody gets put up in the middle and that mistake is being demonstrated, you should look inward to yourself and think, okay, am I doing that too? And that, in a way, is a way of sharing one correction with everybody. And it's also a way of teaching yourself about your ego and how to deal with that. And to add a point to this as well was that Saito Sensei was also aware of it wasn't nice to correct people who were high level, and especially if these people came to the dojo with their students, it would be very embarrassing for him to say "dame" to the instructor of the group of students who was there. So he would find another person who was doing the same mistake as you, and then say "dame" to that person and get them to demonstrate the wrong version of the technique. And the idea was that you were supposed to remember that dame was probably meant for not only that person, but for you as well, and possibly for others. And that is very sort of characteristic of Saito Sensei. And the dame, the corrections weren't because he didn't like you as a person or thought you were terrible or an idiot. He just saw you doing something wrong, and you were doing something wrong that he wanted to make you do better. So in a way, it's a very inclusive way of doing it, but it's just very old school. That was something that I really learned a lot from, is the way that he was dealing with people. And most of all, and this is very important, Saito Sensei made the strongest effort to make the Aikido that he learned from O Sensei available, and not only available, but doable by as many students as at all possible. He broke down the techniques. He counted his way through so that you'd have ikkyo, ich, ni, san. Each movement would have a count so that you could split it up and you could understand it. He would teach the technique slowly. All of these things were done so that as many students as possible would learn the techniques. And at the same time, he would say that when you come to Iwama, you're learning to teach Aikido. He said, if you copy the way that I teach, when you go back to your own dojo, you will make it accessible to your students. And you will also be teaching yourself what the important points of each technique are. So he was teaching a system, a didactic system, as well as he was doing regular class. And that is, in my opinion, a very, very generous concept. Because if you look at the traditional way of teaching, as I said before, it was the sensei would show the technique a few times. He'd say, "Hai dozo," and that was it. You had to, it's called waza o nusumu, to steal the technique. It's a traditional way of learning in Japanese martial arts or in Japanese arts in general. And the idea was that you had to train your own senses to glean, to absorb, see and understand everything that the sensei was doing, because you weren't going to get any explanations. There are even cases of traditional sensei teaching the wrong thing to sort of test you, to see if you would actually buy what he was teaching, or if you understood the principles well enough to know, that's maybe not the real way to do it. But Saito Sensei had none of that. For him, the most important thing was that as many people as possible could learn to do the techniques that he was given by O Sensei, so that it would keep the technical legacy alive. And that, to me, is the sign of a very, very generous heart. And that was what really, really spoke to my heart in terms of Saito Sensei's teaching and him as a person. And he was a very, very strong and very, very, very self-confident person. There's no doubt about it. But he didn't have a big ego. He had a lot of self-confidence, but he didn't have a big ego. He could laugh at himself and make jokes, be funny, and he would be funny in the dojo as well. He had a great sense of humor. So he didn't take himself seriously in that way. He took his Aikido very seriously. But when you saw him doing his Aikido, it wasn't Saito Sensei that was in the foreground. It was the Aikido. He didn't pose. His zanshin, his final positions were beautiful and strong, but you didn't see any ego in the techniques. If you watch some senseis, you'll see that there's a difference there. They are projecting themselves as well as projecting their Aikido. Whereas Saito Sensei, it was just the Aikido that was being shown there. It was in Saito Sensei's body and spirit, but it was egoless in my opinion. So that was my real, the strongest impression that I had from Saito Sensei.
Okay, it's a really nice presentation and really deep with detail. And we received Beyond So some weeks ago, and he told about the group you talk about as you, Patrick Cassidy, Miles Kessler, and a thing I want to discuss with you is you were in Iwama during the change of syllabus in Saito Sensei's teaching. When we see the old video, we saw some sort of Kentaijo, we saw some sort of Kumijo, of Kumitashi. And it's not exactly the same as the kata we are doing now. So I know you are kind of historian of Saito Sensei teaching in the practice and in kata. And later I will present your book to all people, because for me it's amazing book in Bukiwaza. So can you please tell us about how Saito Sensei's teaching evolved during this year?
Yes. I don't know if I'm a historian, but I love the history of it. And I try to immerse myself in as much of the history as I can. I started training in 1976, and the Aikido that Tomita Sensei gave us was it was Saito Sensei's Aikido, but Saito Sensei had developed from the time that Tomita Sensei stopped training with him, which was in 1969. And so even the first time that I went there, Saito Sensei was making some points where the different technical points that were different. For instance, one point was, I'll get to the Bukiwaza as well, but this sort of is the foundation of it. The one point he made was about our hanmi. He saw us standing in what I call old hanmi, where the front foot is pointing slightly outwards, a little bit like the Yoshinkan hanmi, but the Yoshinkan is even more at an angle outwards, the front foot. And he saw us standing that way, and he pointed out just very, very carefully. He didn't give us dame. He said, "Oh, yeah, you can do it that way, but now basically." He said, I point the front foot directly forward. And he said that with the hanmi, with the front foot pointing at an angle, he said that the front foot or leg can move easily in the direction where the toes are pointing. But if you want to move in the opposite direction, then you have to change the position of the foot to move. So there's his point being that there's an extra movement there. So the movement is more natural to one side than the other. He said that if the foot is pointing straight forward, it makes it more symmetrical. He didn't say it was wrong. He just said, we used to do that in the old days. So Sensei was constantly, and it's not something that was changed. As I pointed out to you, this book has so many incredible things in it, and it has the diagrams as well. And you'll find diagrams here that show that the foot pointing straight forward, as well as the foot pointing outwards. So I think Sensei just basically simplified it to saying in general, just point the front foot forward. In terms of the weapons syllabus, he would say that he developed the Kensuburi based on what he saw O-sensei doing. But O-sensei didn't teach the Suburi in the way that Saito Sensei did. It seems like that O-sensei taught to a certain extent different sort of cuts and things, but not as systematically as Saito Sensei did. And I want to point out, this is a very important point, that Saito Sensei systematized what O-sensei was doing. O-sensei didn't teach the way Saito Sensei taught. Saito Sensei told us that O-sensei didn't teach 1, 2, 3. He didn't teach with counts or anything like that. And he actually said O-sensei didn't really like that kind of systematic teaching. He was old school. Saito Sensei didn't say he was old school, but that's what he meant. But O-sensei saw Saito Sensei systematizing his Aikido, and he saw him teaching his Aikido. And everything that Saito Sensei did, he had it acknowledged by O-sensei. He would never do anything that O-sensei didn't approve of. So everything that Saito Sensei systematized was seen and accepted by O-sensei as a means to make Aikido more accessible. And the story goes also that O-sensei didn't really like that kind of systematization. So Saito Sensei had to really push his opinion on O-sensei to try to make him understand that this is for the better good. This will help Aikido in the future. And it worked. O-sensei accepted Saito Sensei's way of teaching and way of systematizing. So going back, the Saito Sensei made the Ken Suburi, and the awase that we now do, which are systematized, are in an older versions that you will find in actually in this book, and you also find them in the old footage that was recorded together with this book and the traditional Aikido series. But Saito Sensei consolidated those awase into the 4 awase that we do now: Migi, Hidari, and Gono awase and Shichi no awase, because he found that those 4 are the most direct way of learning how to do the more complicated and advanced kumitachi. And the kumitachi, Sensei always said that these were sword techniques that were handed down from, in the book it says, from a traditional sword school. It was Kashima Shinto Ryu that has been proven by researchers, by Stan Pranin. And O-sensei had teachers come from the Kashima Shinto Ryu and teach in his dojo, but O-sensei didn't train directly under them. That would have been too strange to have a master teacher training under people who were not his level. But O-sensei, this may be something that people know or not, but I'll just emphasize it. But O-sensei was signed into the ledger of the Kashima Shinto Ryu with a blood oath, the Keppan. But it was his son, Kishimaru Sensei, and one other student, I think it was Zenzaburo Akazawa Sensei, who were signed into the ledger. So those 2 trained under the tutelage of different senseis from Kashima Shinto Ryu, and O-sensei observed. But the kumitachi are said to come from that school. So Saito Sensei would always say, they are written in stone, they're carved in stone. He had to leave them that way. He made slight alterations in the timing and the distance of some of the techniques, but the forms themselves, they were no touch. He couldn't touch them. He wouldn't touch them in respect of them being O-sensei's ownership. In the Kumi-jo, or the Jo, it was different, because O-sensei's Jo was an amalgamation of all sorts of different influences. There wasn't, you can't really trace it to one direct school. And it definitely isn't Musoryu Jodo, of which Saito Sensei would speak very highly of, but he would also make the point that the Aikijo is not Musoryu. He said there's certain things that you can see that they do in Musoryu that we don't do in Aikijo. He said it's not wrong, it's just different. So I think that's important to know. But the Suburi, the 20 Suburi, were made by Saito Sensei. Saito Sensei watching O-sensei and seeing the movements that O-sensei was doing, and then putting them into a systematized order so that you could learn how to do the more complex Jo work. The Kumi-jo were also O-sensei's work. They were things that he saw O-sensei doing, or the principles that O-sensei was doing, but Saito Sensei put them together on his own. And that was also why he was able to change them, and also he added on. There were originally 7 Kumi-jo that you can see in the old book, and then he added 3 when he was given he was awarded a very, very high medal by the Japanese government, and I'm not sure if it was by the emperor, but it was he was awarded a very, very high medal, and he was asked to do a demonstration, and so he wanted to do 10 kumijo, so he developed the 3 of them, but he felt that it was in order for him to do that because they were things that he created himself. The 31 kata, Saito Sensei always said that this was a kata that he saw O Sensei doing. He learned it, which means he basically stole it in the way that you traditionally did. You watched your teacher do it, and he said that O Sensei did this form enough times so that Saito Sensei could get the whole series. The 13 kata, Saito Sensei said that it was a part of a longer kata, but Saito Sensei could never get the end of it, the rest of it. So instead of making up something by himself, he chose to stay with what he was sure O Sensei did. And those are the 13 movements that the 13 kata consists of. And that also demonstrates Saito Sensei's loyalty towards O Sensei. He didn't want to make something up and add it to O Sensei's work. So he left the 13 kata as it was. The 31 kata kumijo, again, Saito Sensei made that, and that means that it came, I think it was made in the early 1980s. So it was what you call, in karate, you call it bunkai. It is a kind of application, one form of interpreting the applications of the kata. And Saito Sensei worked on that throughout his life, and especially the last 27 to 31. There's a huge amount of variations of different versions that Saito Sensei experimented with and then moved on. I don't know that many of them. I know Paolo Sensei from Italy has a photographic memory, so he has the entire list of them and can do them by heart. But the final version that we ended with is the version that I put in my book, and there are actually two versions of that as well, because the footwork was shown differently. Saito Sensei said you could do both. So I think it's important to understand that, and oh yes, and then there's the Kentaijo. There were the original Kentaijo, which there are 10 of, and they're also in the book. And they are also on the old black and white footage that accompanies the traditional Aikido series. And they're fantastic. I try to work with them, but they're also quite difficult because there's some movements that are quite hard to understand. Until you see them in the film footage, you can easily misunderstand them. So it's very important to see them in motion and to refer from the book versions to the film versions. To be specific, in number 2, the second. Oh no! I'm sorry. There's several of them, but the number 2 is the awase, the ken awase. I'm thinking of. I'm confusing those two. The ken awase that you'll find here is there's the one which is based on doing the Nino Suburi.
Yes.
Or you step back and go into Jodan Kamai and then step forward. That one feels very strange when you do it the way that the book is showing, because you're crossing the line of the sword, and it feels very dangerous until you see that the actual application is when the ski comes in, that you avoid by stepping back and going into Jodan, as in the Nino Suburi. At that point, Uchitachi slide steps back to go out of range, and then he attacks again. And that is when you can enter with the strike, and you're entering to the opposite side of the sword. The other version is that Saito Sensei does a second version of the same, where he attacks directly on the same side as he steps back on, But that is also as the person, as Uchitachi pulls back. So it's fascinating to see these things. And if you compare the version here and the version on film, you'll be able to see it.
And just some quote, because you said something really interesting about Saito Sensei's trying to systematize the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
In the first Kentaijo, in the first Awase, we saw something more at action reaction. I have always in mind Kentaijo, where you do a kind of the second Kentaijo, but you're not waiting shomen. You're doing this movement and you're coming back.
That's in the old one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And all Kentaijo, all Awase of Ken are really more like action reaction and feeling of movement and feeling of the attention.
Yeah. Well, it's we were talking about this last time, Mathieu. The first old Kentaijo is basically sen sen no sen. Is it you're going in before the attack and doing a parry to the attacker's sword, and we have. I just want to clarify again. We use the terms go no sen, sen no sen, sen sen no sen. And I've wrote this in the book as well, I think, or I put it in I have an article where I've written about sen sen no sen. I'm not sure if it's in the book. But the point was that O-sensei was actually asked about Gono-sen, if Aikido was Gono-sen or what, in an interview, radio interview. And it was recorded and it was written down. I found it written somewhere. And O-sensei became very angry at the interviewer because he said, Aikido is way above that kind of concept. He said, it's way above go no sen, sen no sen, sen sen no sen. He said, it's on a completely different level. But I think for us who are following in the footsteps hopefully of O-sensei, O-sensei grew up with Budo around him, and traditional Budo, especially the sword ryuha, used that concept of timing, the three sort of traditional concepts of timing. So I think that it has value to use those concepts as well, even though O-sensei said that Aikido was more developed than that. So the old first Kentaijo, you basically go in and do a kind of parry to the sword right away. We have it in the kumitachi as well. The ichinotachi is sen sen no sen. It's ukitachi that actually initiates. We have it in san no tachi as well. Ukitachi sweeps the sword. So it's there, and that's very important to understand that Aikido is not only go no sen. It's not only defensive or reactional. As is Budo in general, it can be proactive. But the point is that the person who is the attacker is the attacker. That person has already committed himself to attacking. But in certain cases, you don't let that person take the initiative. You take the initiative away from them by doing sen sen no sen. So you're not attacking an innocent person, which would go against the moral foundation of Aikido. You are still defending yourself because the person is going to attack you, but you're not waiting for that person to take the initiative. Not always. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Is it the same feeling as Yamabiko no Michi that Saito Sensei wrote in his book?
Yamabiko no Michi was something that Saito Sensei specifically would use the example of the Shomanuchi Iriminage. And he had a progression of that series of techniques, Shomanuchi Iriminage, that he would do. And the first would be, and again, this is something that is specific to the Iwama school or form. When we do shomanuchi as kihon, we initiate, and our shoman comes from below and up towards the center using tegatana, towards uke's center. That is not only specific in Iwama Aikido. You see it in others as well. Yoshinkan, I believe, has it. And I've seen it in what we call mainstream Aikido. I see Kishimaru Sensei doing it. I see Dosho Sensei doing it. And I've also seen Waka Sensei, Dojo Cho doing it. But I haven't heard them talk about it specifically. I've seen Tada Sensei specify very directly that you don't wait for uke to attack you. If you're standing there, then you initiate. And I saw him teach that in front of a huge class at the IAF, International Aikido Federation Congress in Takasaki. And he was so specific about it. But most people will do the basic shomanuchi as a down strike. Saito Sensei said, don't block. If the strike is already on its way down, don't block it, don't stop it. You have to move to another position. And from there, certain techniques will be available, certain won't be. But the sen no sen is so important, but so difficult to explain. So that we were talking about this last time, Mathieu, that I think that most teachers have sort of given up on it because you have to, in order to explain the fact that you are initiating, to call out the person. Saito Sensei would say, Aite no ki o yobidasu. Aite no ki, the ki of your opponent. Yobidasu means to call out the ki of your opponent. And that's what you're doing when you do this. You're not waiting for the attack to come. You have to go through a long explanation of sen no sen, sen no sen, and sen no sen not being aggressive, but it's still being defensive. And so I think basically most teachers said, "Oh, forget it. Let them just attack."
Okay. And so thank you for this information, because I know it's complicated to explain all these details out of the mat. And so thank you. And
you're welcome.
So it's really interesting because you talk about Saito Sensei, Iwama teaching, and all your life in Japan and Iwama. And when Saito Sensei passed away, you have a choice to do, and you had something to do. Did I follow his son, or did I do another thing? So I really enjoy the talk we have about this subject, how you conceal Iwama practice and your Aikikai vision. So can you explain all of these things to everyone?
Yes, well, first of all, and first and foremost, I think that it's very, very important for me to say that Hitohiro Sensei chose to create his own organization, and I think it's a wonderful thing that he did. It's he followed Saito Sensei all his life, but he also I think wants to explore. And you can see he's going back and studying old source schools, Katori Shintoryu, I think, and I'm not sure if Kashima also is there. He's researching, he's looking at what O-sensei did in the old days. He has created his own lineage, and he has his own students now. I was a student of Saito Sensei, and he was my sensei. So when he passed away, I still, the things that he tried to teach me, and that I tried to learn from him are things that I can work on for the rest of my life. And I still won't get anywhere close. So my choice was is also what Saito Sensei expressed to us through Paolo Sensei and Uru Sensei, who were sort of they were his top representatives of the group of dojos that he had in Europe, or that Saito Sensei was the leader of. And he asked them to please get closer to Aikikai. And I have a feeling that Saito Sensei was trying to do that himself, but I think that he didn't have as much time on this earth as he thought he would. So he didn't manage to fulfill that idea. So our group, through here in Scandinavia, through the very, very hard work of Ulf Sensei, a Swedish sensei called Stefan Stenud Sensei, who was active in the IAF at that time as well, and one of the highest ranking people in Sweden as well. Those two helped our group in Denmark have our Iwamo Ryu ranks converted and to come back into the organization of Aikikai. We hadn't separated from Aikikai at any time, but we weren't active. And many people just received ranks from Saito Sensei. And so they helped us. From the Japanese side, Isoyama Sensei helped us greatly from the Iwamo. Yonimochi Sensei and Somamiya Sensei from the International Department of the Aikikai Hombo Dojo helped us greatly, and Hombo Dojo in general helped us to become an active part again of the Aikikai. And as we spoke about before, Matthew, the way that I see it is that the core of Aikido, the organization of Aikido, is represented by the lineage of O-sensei. It's a kind of bloodline. In Japan, you have the system called Iemoto, which is basically a bloodline that continues from one generation to another. And that is what is the core of the Hombo Dojo and Aikikai. And that to me represents the cultural legacy, historical legacy of the founder. And Aikikai is, as one of my my dear friends, Charlie McGinnis Sensei, put recently, he said that this was Kim Puso Sensei I was talking with from California. He said that he considers the Aikikai Hombo Dojo to be the glue that binds us together. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. And we are a part of an international, global group of people who practice Aikido, all paying tribute to where that Aikido comes from, which is the founder. And I want my students to understand the value of that, to understand that it's a value that comes from the heart, and it belongs to, we're paying tribute, and we should be proud of being a part of the legacy of O-sensei, which Hombo Dojo represents. And that I think each person has to find their own way and to decide which way, which path they want to follow. But for me, that's the way that I feel, and that's the way that we've chosen in terms of having Aikikai Hombo Dojo as the representative core of the Aikido, coming straight from the founder.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
And one more question now from more from your teaching, because something we talk about is something really important for the future, is preserving what Saito Sensei taught, and not just imagine or adding something from Saito Sensei teaching. So can you explain your vision about this? What Saito Sensei teach, what you can create from Saito Sensei teaching, and what is your own teaching?
Yes, well, again, this is something I do remember I have in the book. To create or not to create is the title of the little piece that I wrote. And I think both things are very relevant. And that has to do with the concept of shuhari that I think people may be familiar with. But Saito Sensei didn't practice the shuhari. He didn't discard the teaching that he got from O Sensei and create his own. His point was that of all the Aikido, the wonderful Aikido that he'd seen being practiced by so many senseis out there who were students of O Sensei, as he was himself, he hadn't really seen anything that was better than O Sensei's Aikido. So he felt that he would just basically stick with what he learned from O Sensei. And he was happy with that. He felt that there was more than enough for him to devote his life to working on. And that was his attitude. And I feel the same, just in one more generation separated from O Sensei. But as a student of Saito Sensei, like I said before, he gave us so much to work on. Now, you can use the Aikido that you have learned in ways, in free practice. Techniques will evolve and they'll sort of come out of nowhere when you're doing Jiuwaza. And they may not be something that you've seen Saito Sensei do, but they will be based on principles that you've learned from him. But I'm not trying intentionally to create new techniques and to present them for my students as something new and innovative. And I think that it's important that as students of Saito Sensei, if you do think of new variations, new things to do, maybe new techniques, it's important that you state the source from which these techniques come, because otherwise people will not be able to know what was actually Saito Sensei's teaching and what is your own development, which is fine, but you should be able to know in order to keep the legacy of Saito Sensei intact. So for instance, at the moment I'm working on doing basic suburi, and then doing what I've heard people call suburi kata, which means you do a basic suburi, and then I try to figure out, okay, if I want to defend to the rear, how can I do that? Adding on to the basic suburi. And there are different variations, different ways you can do that feel natural, keeping within the principles of what we've learned. And you can tell when you're doing something that sort of breaks those principles. So, and I find that interesting, being able to build on what you're doing, but keeping each suburi completely intact so that you're not changing anything, but you're teaching yourself different applications. If I want to do a suburi, then I have to defend to the right flank. How can I move naturally into another position to do that? If I want to protect myself from the left flank and counterattack, how can I do that? But always based on keeping the basic suburi intact and then adding on. But I always tell my students, this is not something that Saito Sensei was teaching. Basic suburi looks like this. But what happens if you want to do a defense to that direction or that direction or that direction? How could we do that without going outside of the principles and the parameters that we've learned from our Aikido? So I'm trying to keep the source very clear if I'm experimenting with something, so that people know what was Saito Sensei teaching and what am I working on in terms of experimenting with, you could call it Oyo applications or Henka variations.
Okay. Oh, you are talking about Enka and Oyowaza. So can you just explain the difference and how you use it, how Saito Sensei use it? Because this term sometimes really difficult to differentiate or to explain or to put a technique on.
Yes. Well, they really do overlap. And I often hear, or I've heard the term Oyo Henka. And I think that's basically because people, and this is also used by Japanese instructors, they might not be able to classify it as one or the other. Henka means variation. Oyo means application. And so it is, they do overlap. The way I see it generally is that Oyowaza is if you're in a situation where you're doing a technique and you can't really get that technique to work because something has changed, then you do a changeover into another application that will work. It could be that you're doing a nikyo and the person is blocking your nikyo, so you move around and do a yonkyo, or a rokyo on the elbow instead. That to me would probably be called an Oyowaza, an applied technique. Or it could be an ikkyo that you're doing, and then you do an application to change it. But that could also be called a Henkawaza. So I haven't seen very, very clear distinctions between those two. And basically, if you're doing a technique and you do it differently than your students have seen you do it last time, then you call it a Henkawaza. That'll keep you clear.
Okay. Thank you very much for
You're welcome.
all this information. So